Heard the key turn in the lock at 11:47 at night. I know the exact time because I had been sitting at the kitchen table for 3 hours watching the minute hand on the clock my mother gave me as a wedding gift, the one with the blue ceramic frame that I had packed and unpacked through 4 different houses over 43 years of marriage. I wasn't worried. That's the part that still embarrasses me when I think about it. After all that time, I had stopped being worried and started being simply tired. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened to me. What matters is that I was 64 years old. I had given my entire adult life to a man and a family and a house that always smelled like lemon furniture polish, and on a Tuesday night in October, everything I thought I knew turned out to be a story I had told myself to get through the days. My husband's name was Frank. Franklin Edward Holloway, though nobody called him Franklin except his mother when she was still alive and angry at him for something. To me, he was Frank. To our daughter, he was Dad. To the woman I would later find out had been receiving $2,400 a month from our joint savings account for the past 5 years. He was apparently something else entirely. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what happens when you've been sitting with a story long enough. It wants to come out all at once, like water through a crack in a dam. Let me go back to the beginning, or at least to the morning that started the end. It was a Thursday in late September when my sister called me from the hospital. Not the call you're imagining. She wasn't sick, she hadn't fallen. She was calling because our Aunt Ruth Ann, my mother's youngest sister, had passed away in her sleep at 81, quietly and without any apparent suffering, in the assisted living facility in Scottsdale, where she'd spent her last 4 years. I hadn't seen Aunt Ruth Ann in almost 6 years. We exchanged Christmas cards. She sent our daughter $100 check every birthday without fail, right up until our daughter turned 40 and told her she didn't need to anymore. I cried when my sister told me, not the deep, wrenching kind of grief. Aunt Ruth Ann had lived a full life and had been ready to go, or so she told anyone who would listen. I cried the way you cry when something from your childhood disappears for good. Aunt Ruth Ann had made the best pecan pie I'd ever tasted. She used to let me sit on her kitchen counter when I was small and stir the filling. Those are the things that hit you. What I did not cry about, because I didn't know yet, was the letter that arrived 11 days later from an attorney's office in Phoenix. I almost didn't open it. The return address said Whitfield and Associates, attorney at law, and I assumed it was something to do with the estate paperwork that would eventually wind its way to my sister and me. I set it on the kitchen counter next to the fruit bowl and forgot about it for 2 days. When I finally opened it on a Saturday morning while Frank was at his weekly golf game, I read the first paragraph 3 times before my brain accepted what it was saying. Aunt Ruth Ann had left me her estate, not split between my sister and me, to me, specifically by name, with a handwritten note from Ruth Ann attached to the official documents that said only, "You always reminded me of myself, Joni. Don't let anyone tell you what to do with this. Ruth Ann." The estate was valued after taxes and legal fees at just under $2.4 million. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not in a dramatic way. My knees just sort of gave out, and I found myself sitting there on the tile in my bathrobe, holding a piece of paper with the refrigerator humming beside me. $2.4 million. Aunt Ruth Ann had never mentioned money. She drove a 10-year-old Buick. She clipped coupons. She had worked as an office manager for a dental practice for 38 years and apparently, quietly, invested almost everything she earned. Her house in Scottsdale, which she bought in 1987, had appreciated in ways that probably surprised even her. My first thought, after the shock settled into something more like a strange, fizzing disbelief, was that I needed to tell Frank. That was my first thought. Not what will I do with this, not I should call my sister, not even I should call the attorney back. My first instinct, after 43 years of marriage, was to go find my husband and tell him the news. That instinct is what I've thought about most in the months since. The way we are trained, without even knowing it, to immediately hand our good news over to someone else for safekeeping. I waited until he got home from golf. He came in flushed and good-natured the way he always was after a round, dropping his bag by the door even though I had asked him 100 times to put it in the garage. I told him to sit down at the kitchen table. I told him I had something to share. I watched his face while I told him. I was looking for joy, for surprise, for the kind of shared astonishment that you hope for in a long marriage. The moments where something extraordinary happens and you get to be amazed together. Instead, what I saw move across his face was something I can only describe now, with the benefit of hindsight, as calculation. It lasted only a second. Then he smiled and said, "Joni, that's incredible," and reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I told myself I'd imagined it. Things began to shift in ways I couldn't quite name over the next few weeks. Frank became attentive in a way he hadn't been in years, suggesting we go to dinner, asking about my plans for the money, mentioning that our investment portfolio could really benefit from some restructuring. He brought up a financial advisor he'd apparently been talking to, a friend of a friend, someone who could help us make the most of the inheritance. I said I wanted to think about it. He said, of course, no rush. 2 weeks later, he mentioned the financial advisor again. I want to be clear about something. I am not a naive woman. I raised 2 children largely on my own while Frank built his commercial real estate business. I managed our household finances for years before Frank decided he wanted to take over the accounts. His word, take over, as if our shared financial life was a territory to be claimed. I had a business degree from my high estate that I had never really used because Frank's career had always been the one that mattered more. Or at least that was the quiet assumption that had run beneath our marriage like a current I only noticed when I stopped swimming. But I had loved him. I want that to be clear too. Whatever came after, I had genuinely loved him, and for a long time I believed he loved me. It was our daughter who first said something. She had come to visit for a long weekend in November, and on the second night after Frank had gone to bed early, she sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea and said carefully, "Mom, have you looked at the bank statements recently?" I hadn't. Not in years, really. Frank handled all of that. She had. She'd asked to see them, said she was helping us organize financial documents for estate planning, which was true, but also, I understood now, was a reason she'd manufactured specifically to be able to look. She slid a printed page across the table to me. There was a recurring transfer every month on the 15th, $2,400 going out to an account I didn't recognize. It had been happening for 5 years, 60 months, $144,000 gone, and I had never once seen it because I had stopped looking, and Frank had made sure I stayed not looking. I stared at the paper for a long time. "Mum," my daughter said, her voice was very quiet, "do you know who Sheila is?" I did not know who Sheila was. I found out. I didn't confront Frank that night. I know that might seem strange. Some people, when they find out, want to explode immediately, want to see the look on the person's face, want the confrontation to happen right now, tonight, with all the dishes still on the table. I understand that impulse. I just wasn't built that way. Instead, I went to bed beside my husband of 43 years, and I lay there in the dark listening to him breathe, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, I am going to do this correctly. I called an attorney in the morning, while Frank was at the office. A woman, I specifically wanted a woman who specialized in divorce and financial disputes. Her name was Eleanor, and within the first 10 minutes of our conversation I understood that I had been catastrophically underprepared for the reality of my own financial life. Eleanor asked me questions I couldn't answer. What assets were in my name alone? I didn't know. What was the current value of the retirement accounts? I didn't know. Did I have access to the business financials? I did not. What I did have, sitting in a trust account that Eleanor helped me establish in my name only, on the advice of the attorney in Phoenix, before I told Frank anything else, was $2.4 million. Eleanor told me not to touch it. She told me to do nothing that would signal I was preparing to act. She told me to be patient. Patience, it turned out, was something I had spent 43 years developing. What I learned over the next 2 months, piece by piece, with the help of Eleanor and a forensic accountant named Howard, who wore the same brown cardigan every time I saw him and had the gentle, methodical manner of someone who had seen every variety of human dishonesty without being particularly surprised by any of it. What I learned was this: the woman named Sheila was not a recent development. She and Frank had been together, in the full sense of the word, for 6 years. She was 51 years old, which I mention not out of bitterness, but because it is a fact. She worked in the leasing department of one of Frank's commercial properties. The $2,400 a month was listed in Frank's business records as a consulting fee. Howard also found, buried in the business accounts, evidence that Frank had been systematically transferring assets out of our joint holdings over the past 3 years. Not all at once, slowly, carefully, in amounts that looked like normal business expenses if you didn't look too closely. He was building a separate financial foundation. He had been planning, Howard told me in his even, unsurprised voice, to eventually leave. He was simply waiting until the right moment. I thought about the look on Frank's face when I told him about the inheritance. I understood now what that calculation had been. He had been doing math. He had been figuring out whether to accelerate his timeline. What he hadn't counted on was that I'd started doing math too. I did not tell Frank I knew anything. I continued to make dinner on the nights he came home for dinner, which were fewer than they used to be. I continued to ask about his golf games. I continued to be the woman he had decided was too comfortable, too unaware, too attached to her kitchen timer and her garden and her routines to ever look up and see clearly. I spent those 2 months making sure that when I finally did act, there would be nothing left for him to hide. The moment came on a Sunday afternoon in January. Our daughter was there. I had asked her to be, and she had driven 4 hours to sit in my living room and hold my hand if I needed it. Our son was not there. I want to say that gently but honestly, our son had been told by Frank, at some point during those months, some version of events that positioned Frank as the aggrieved party. Our son called me twice during that period, and both times seemed to be gently suggesting that I think about what I really wanted and whether this was worth it. He meant well, I believe, but he was his father's son in ways that I had never quite let myself see. Frank came home to find me sitting at the kitchen table with Eleanor beside me. He knew, in the way people know, before a word was said. I watched the same calculation cross his face that had crossed it the day I told him about the inheritance, except this time it arrived and found nothing to work with. I told him I knew about Sheila. I told him I knew about the transfers. I told him I had documentation of all of it and that Eleanor was there not to negotiate, but to make clear to him what the next steps would be if he chose to make things difficult. He looked at me for a long moment, then he looked at Eleanor. Then he looked back at me and said, "Joni, I think we should talk about this privately." I said, "We are talking about it." He tried 3 different approaches over the course of that conversation. The first was minimization. It wasn't what it looked like. The money had been for legitimate business purposes. Sheila was just a friend. The second was appeal. We had 43 years, didn't that mean something? Couldn't we work through this? The third, when neither of the first two worked, was a quiet and unmistakable threat. He knew people, he had lawyers, this could get expensive and ugly for everyone involved. Eleanor did not even blink. She had a folder on the table in front of her. She opened it and slid 3 pages across to Frank and let him read them quietly. Howard had done thorough work. The fraudulent business transfers, classified under Arizona law as dissipation of marital assets, were documented in detail. Eleanor explained, in the same pleasant conversational tone she used for everything, that Frank could cooperate with the divorce proceedings, or she could file a formal complaint with the state attorney's office that same week. Frank went very still. The thing about a man who has spent years being very smart about money is that he understands immediately, when the numbers are laid in front of him by someone smarter, exactly how exposed he is. He signed the preliminary agreement 2 weeks later. The divorce took 8 months. It was not simple and it was not painless. Our son didn't speak to me for 4 of those months, which was its own particular grief, separate from everything else, the kind of hurt that doesn't have a clean category. Our daughter was with me every step, sometimes in person, sometimes just on the phone at 10 o'clock at night when I couldn't sleep and needed to hear a voice that was on my side. Howard's documentation had been thorough enough that the dissipated assets were ordered returned or compensated for as part of the settlement. The house was mine. A significant portion of the retirement accounts was mine. The business, which Frank had built but which had been funded partly by years of household income I had contributed to, was subject to evaluation. That process was slow, and I'm not going to pretend I understood every part of it. What I will tell you is what I walked away with, and I'll tell you plainly because I think women in long marriages are not told plainly enough how these things work and what they are entitled to between the settlement, the retirement accounts, and Aunt Ruth Ann's inheritance kept entirely in my name throughout. I was more financially secure at 64 than I had ever been at any point in my marriage. The irony is not lost on me that Frank's plan, his patient, years-long plan to extract himself from our marriage with as much as possible, accelerated the timeline of my own awakening. If he hadn't started moving money, Howard might have had nothing to find. If he hadn't started moving money, I might have agreed to let his friend restructure my inheritance into accounts Frank had access to. If he hadn't tipped his hand with that look across the kitchen table, I might have handed everything over and called it love. Aunt Ruth Ann wrote on that note, "Don't let anyone tell you what to do with this." I don't think she knew, when she wrote it, how specifically that advice would apply. Frank was served with a civil complaint by the state attorney's office 8 months after our divorce was finalized. I did not file it. Eleanor had reported the financial fraud as part of her professional obligations, and once that process started, it moved on its own momentum. I found out the way I found out many things during that period. My daughter called me. She called on a Tuesday morning and said, "Mom, Dad's been charged." I was standing in my garden when she called. I'd taken up gardening seriously in the months after the divorce, not as therapy or not only as therapy, but because I'd always wanted a proper kitchen garden and had never gotten around to it because there was always something else that needed doing first. I had tomatoes and herbs and the small raised bed of lettuces, and I was standing there in the morning light with dirt on my gardening gloves when my daughter told me that Frank had been formally charged with financial fraud. I said, "Okay." She said, "Are you okay?" I thought about it honestly, the way you can think about things honestly when you're 64 and standing in your own garden in the morning and you have learned, finally, to take the time to actually answer the question. "Yes," I said, "I think I actually am." Our son came to see me 3 months after that. He drove up unannounced on a Saturday, which is very like him. He's always assumed he'll be welcome, which I suppose means I've always made him feel that way. He stood on my porch looking like a man who had rehearsed something and forgotten it, and eventually said that he thought he hadn't handled everything well and that he was sorry. I let him in. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with Eleanor, where I had once sat across from Frank and watched his face do its calculations, where I had sat alone at 11:47 at night watching a clock. My son said, "I think I wanted to believe it wasn't as bad as it was." I said I understood that. I did understand it, actually. It's easier to believe in a version of your father that doesn't require you to revise everything you thought you knew about your family. I had spent 43 years doing a version of that same thing. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. I don't want to wrap this up too neatly because the truth is that some things don't wrap up neatly, and one of the things I've let go of in this chapter of my life is the expectation that they should. My son and I are finding our way back to each other, slowly, the way you find your way back to someone when the path has been disrupted and you both have to watch your footing. That's enough. That's actually enough. I'm writing this, or telling this, I suppose, because I want someone to hear it who needs to. I know you're out there because I was you, the woman who stopped looking at the bank statements because it was easier to trust, who handed over the good news before she'd even finished feeling it herself, who sat at a kitchen table at midnight wondering when things had gotten so quiet. Here is what Aunt Ruth Ann understood that I didn't until I was forced to. Money in a marriage is not just money. It is the physical form of who has choices and who doesn't. It is the mechanism by which one person can quietly construct an exit while the other person is doing the laundry and trusting that the life she thinks she has is the life she actually has. I don't say this to be bitter about Frank or even to be angry, though I was angry, deeply and thoroughly angry in ways I hadn't let myself be angry in years. I say it because I wish someone had said it to me at 35. I wish someone had sat me down and said, "Know your own numbers. Keep something in your own name, not because your husband is untrustworthy, but because you are a person, and people need to know where they stand." The kitchen garden has tomatoes coming in now. I made a pecan pie last week. Aunt Ruth Ann's recipe, which I found on an index card in the box of her things that the attorney sent along with the estate documents. The crust was a little imperfect. I ate 2 pieces standing at the counter. I don't wait for anyone to come home anymore. I don't watch the minute hand on my mother's clock and count the hours. I go to bed when I'm tired, and I wake up when I wake up, and the garden needs tending, and the pie recipe needs practice, and it turns out that 64, when it belongs entirely to you, is not too late to begin. I used to think the hardest part of what happened was finding out about Sheila, or seeing Howard's spreadsheets with all those transfers laid out in rows, each one a small, quiet theft. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was understanding that I had made it easy. Not because I was foolish, I want to be clear about that, but because I had confused loyalty with willful blindness, and I had been doing it for so long that it felt like love. Frank didn't become who he was overnight, and I didn't become someone who stopped looking at her own bank statements overnight either. These things happen the way water shapes stone, gradually, without drama, until one day you look down and notice the shape of things has changed completely. There is a kind of cause and effect in long marriages that nobody talks about at the beginning. Every time I handed something over, the accounts, the decisions, the financial details I told myself I didn't need to worry about, I was making a small choice. And small choices, made consistently over years, build the architecture of your life whether you're paying attention or not. What I had to reckon with, sitting at my kitchen table at 64, was that integrity isn't only about what other people do to you, it's also about the standards you hold for your own life, your willingness to look clearly at what's in front of you, even when looking is uncomfortable. Frank failed that standard catastrophically, but I had let the muscle of my own clear-sightedness atrophy from years of disuse. Ruth Ann's note, "Don't let anyone tell you what to do with this," landed differently than she could have imagined, because what I had to learn was not just how to manage money, but how to manage my own willingness to see. The thing I'm most grateful for, strange as it sounds, is that I didn't fall apart. I didn't collapse into grief or panic or the kind of despair that makes people make terrible decisions quickly. I called Eleanor. I listened to Howard. I sat with information I didn't like, and I let it make me sharper rather than smaller. That steadiness. I didn't know I had it until I needed it. It had been there all along, underneath 43 years of making other people's lives run smoothly, waiting for me to need it for myself. I think about my daughter, who drove 4 hours to sit with me and knew to bring the bank statements and knew not to make it dramatic. She had a quality of mind I hope I gave her somewhere along the way, the ability to face a hard thing directly, without flinching and without cruelty. That's what I would want for anyone listening to this. Not revenge, not bitterness, not even justice, though justice came, just the willingness to look, to think clearly, and to keep going. 64 isn't too late to build something that's entirely your own. That's not optimism. That's just what I found out to be true.